So, good morning, Timothy.
Good morning, Maya.
This was our new intro to the sessions, Sunday morning sessions. I hope that you like it.
Sounds great.
Sounds great. Thank you for that. And you are once again in Katsuyama?
I'm in downtown Katsuyama reporting live from the good ship Santana.
Great. How about that? So, thank you very much for being there, for being with us. And good morning to everybody who has joined us on LinkedIn and YouTube, also on Clubhouse. Just a moment. I'm now starting the room there too. Ho ho. Okay, we are on air there too. So, good morning to everybody once again who joined us on the three platforms which we are live streaming to at the moment. They are Clubhouse, LinkedIn, and YouTube. Today we've got Timothy Langley, Chief Executive Officer, and the main driving force of Langley Esquire. Yes, a public affairs agency in downtown Tokyo who is very well versed in Japanese politics because of his long experience here in Japan and in the field of politics as well. So, Timothy, what are we going to talk about today?
Thanks very much for the intro, Maya. You know, this program that you've put together on Clubhouse and LinkedIn continues to grow. We have more than 100 people in the audience regularly every Sunday when we talk about Japanese politics. Japanese politics is not everybody's cup of tea, but for those who are even mildly interested, getting your toes wet is, it's kind of like you have to go all the way up to the hips to really appreciate it. And we hope that this program gives people that kind of foundation. So love to talk about it. Every week we're here, more than a year going strong, Maya. Thank you very much for all the work that you've done.
Thank you very much to you, because without you, it wouldn't have been possible. Here we
It's
go.
amazing that nobody else is doing it. We don't have any other commentators or people who are versed in Japanese politics that have decided to educate people or talk about it. We don't do it in a satirical way or in with humor, because there's a lot to be funny about, but just to bring the basic facts about what's going on, what's important, what to watch out for, who are the players. And I think it's really important for people who live in Japan or that are dealing with Japan to understand these kind of dynamics, because it does make sense.
Yes, it does indeed. And I can say that I have learned a lot during the past 1 year and 2 months, thanks to you again. And yes, it does make sense. A lot of things start getting together, and it's easier to put the big picture together, the puzzle actually together. So, and that's all thanks to these weekly briefings. Thank you. Shall we
Thank you.
start with the briefing today
Let's
then?
Thank you very much.
Great.
Let's get started. So, as usual, ladies and gentlemen, we talk about what's going on in Japanese politics that's meaningful for you if you're running a business or living here or you're having any sort of diplomatic or trade relationship with Japan. And today I'm going to do the same thing. I don't have all the answers, and I'm not deeply meshed in a lot of things that are going on in Japanese politics, but there's a whole lot of people here who are well-versed, Japan hands in their own right. And so I'd like to talk about the things that are hot, that are really topical right now this week. They're different than what we talked about last week. Some are building on that, and some of the things we talk about all the time. For example, the reversion of the Constitution. So I'm going to go through this briefing as quickly as possible. I have about 12 items I want to talk about, and then open it up. And I guess we'll close up the room on LinkedIn and then move solely into Clubhouse for our tit-a-tat, for the open session for questions and answers. And I really implore people, please rescue me by coming up to the stage and asking a couple of questions, so that it really reduces the amount of time that Maya gets to gnaw on my face with her
Indeed.
persistent, piercing questions.
So that's my request to everybody too, so that Timothy can relax. Actually, once we move to Clubhouse and start the
I think when we do
conversation.
this briefing, Maya, you just the whole time you're considering, what question can I ask him that's just going to trip him up or that he doesn't know the answer to. So
That's so
it's
very
always
true.
fun being on stage with you.
Yeah, I cannot sleep on Saturday night because I'm thinking about questions.
Thank you.
Yes.
So everybody, please help me out here. So right off the bat, I'd like to talk about what's going on in the Japanese economy. That is a big deal right now. It is eating up a lot of press. It's eating up a lot of consternation among Japanese policymakers. The president of the Bank of Japan. And I'd like to talk about the redistricting situation. As you might recall, before the next lower house election, we have an upper house election coming in, less than 90 days. But the next lower house election, there needs to be a redistricting of seats, and it's a big issue, and I want to touch upon that. We talked about it a little bit last week, but it's becoming a little bit more heated. I'd like to talk about the number of Ukrainians that are here in Japan, because that's a big issue, and it's actually increasing. The situation between Japan and Russia is really starting to heat up. We've got some action going on in Hokkaido, and also, when we were reporting last week, there was a expulsion of several Russian diplomats and trade representatives. We didn't report on that this last time, but it happened over the last week, and that's pretty shocking, actually. I'd like to talk about COVID and bring you up to date on that. The opening of the doors of Japan's entry points for tourists, for business people. There's been some important movement there. Mr. Suga, there's some things going on with Mr. Suga, the immediately past prime minister, and his desire, his drive to establish himself more firmly in Japanese politics, and he's making great headway there. Mr. Kishida and his cabinet approval, what's going on there? How much ability does he have to actually move things forward? Kei Komura is married to Princess Mako and lives in New York City, attempting to pass the bar. There's been a little bit of news there. It's mostly kind of gossip, but it's interesting because it involves the imperial family and the projection of Japan and what's going on in Japan through the example of this couple in New York. So I want to touch on that just very briefly. And then I want to end up my briefing today on the elections in July 10th. So elections, the election date is July 10th. That's a Sunday, and the campaigning starts 10 days before that. So there will be a lot of things building up to that. Then everything becomes quiet as the posters go up and all of the candidates go out and campaign. So first of all, with the economy, I think everybody knows that the yen has hit 126. I think it hit it 126 yen to the dollar on Friday. Pretty alarming. It hasn't been that high in many years. It kind of is compounded with wholesale price increases that have been the greatest in 4 years. They've gone up incredibly, 7.3% just over the last year. Consumer prices. It's happening in the United States as well, but here in Japan, since the government closely monitors and controls the economy and prices and price increases, having this sort of thing happen, it's pretty rare when it does happen. And then when it eventually does happen, it doesn't come in tiny steps. It usually begins to cascade, and there's a bit of a fear that that's coming down the path. And if you look at all of the other dynamics with the price of energy going up, the restrictions of coal coming in from China, 10% of Japan's coal comes from Russia. Excuse me, I said China, from Russia. They've stopped that. So prices for energy, prices for steel, prices for all of these things that use coal will be increasing. Japan has to go to the world markets to supplement that 10% that is not coming in from Russia. And at the same time, these prices are increasing. So it doesn't look very good for the Japanese economy. The Bank of Japan president, Kuroda, has been on the hot seat in the Diet twice over the last 2 weeks to explain the Bank of Japan policy on inflation and on the rate and what the bond market is doing, because that supplements the price of the yen. And the yen is kept at an artificially high position so that it mollifies all of these fluctuations that are going on throughout the world. but the Japanese government has to supplement the economy by subsidizing many things, and there's only a certain limit that they can do that before the economy either tanks or the Japanese government does something to invigorate the economy so people spend more, they're a little bit more hopeful, the economy begins to take an upward turn. And if you look around, there aren't many vectors that support that. So we're watching it very closely, and a lot of the things that we talk about here have implications towards what those vectors are doing. Are they pushing it up? Are they pulling it down? How is the LDP faring in that kind of environment? You know, with the elections coming up, the LDP has to do something as the rescuer, as the hero of the day, bringing the economy back up. And it's an awful hard fight. It also adds lots of ammunition to the opposition parties to criticize the party in power and to score points there. So that's very important. We talked a little bit about redistricting the election districts for the lower house. It must be done before the next lower house election. That election must occur before 2025. So there's time left, but the lower house elections are more volatile than the upper house elections. The upper house elections are every 3 years, invariably. 50% of the upper house will go up for election. For the lower house, that can happen at any time. And before it happens, this redistricting must happen. The really most interesting part about that is in Yamaguchi, there's Mr. Abe comes from that prefecture, and also Mr. Hayashi, who's the foreign minister, and Mr. Kishida's number 2. Also, Mr. Abe's younger brother, who is the Minister of Defense right now, also comes from that district. So in that district, there are 4 members in the lower house. All of them are in the LDP. So the LDP has a stranglehold on that prefecture. But that's one of the prefectures that has been told to redistrict. You have too many House of Representatives members there, the Supreme Court said. You need to reduce it by 1, and that number will go to one of the 5 districts that needs to increase, Tokyo being one of them. So with that, you've got Mr. Hayashi, Mr. Abe, and Mr. Abe's brother, and another LDP member whose father was once the vice president of the LDP, all competing for that. And it's a really rich mix. Mr. Hayashi and Mr. Abe have been at loggerheads even through the elections of their fathers. So this rivalry goes back a long way. And many will say that among the two, even though Mr. Abe was president of the LDP and prime minister for the longest period of time, in the district, Mr. Hayashi is far more popular. You might remember that he ran and won his seat in the upper house while his father was still in the lower house. His father has since moved on and retired, and Mr. Hayashi gave up his upper house seat, you might remember, to run in the lower house just this last election when Mr. Kishida became prime minister. So now he's in the lower house. And the reason why he did that is because, well, for several reasons, but one of them is because the prime minister never comes from the upper house. The prime minister is always selected from the lower house. So this is kind of a signal from Mr. Hayashi that I want to become prime minister, and he's actually putting a lot of pieces in place to secure that possibility. As foreign minister, he is very active. You might have noticed that he's traveling incredibly now. He'll go to Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan next week. He's on a 4-nation tour to solidify Japan's response to Ukraine and to the Russian invasion. And one of the things we're going to talk about later is the approval rating of the Kishida cabinet. And one of the points that the public always focus on is Japan's response and Japan's stance with regard to Russia and also to Ukraine. So those numbers are actually coming up, and Mr. Kishida is supporting that by sending his foreign minister, as you would expect, to these countries, and it's drumming up a lot of interest, and it's developing a lot of appreciation for the cabinet. So This rivalry between Mr. Abe and Mr. Hayashi is going to reach a fever pitch, not now, not in this next upcoming election, but the maneuvering that's going on now. You can see it in how the various factions fight over the election for the upper house. The Ukrainians in Japan are increasing. The Japanese government has changed its policy in a couple of ways. Number one, you might remember that Mr. Hayashi went to Poland 2 weeks ago and returned on a Japanese flight, a government flight, with 20 refugees. It's the first time for the Japanese government to bring non-Japanese on a government-supported flight. So that policy has changed, and it's also changed in the last week since then, that the Japanese government will support and pay for refugees coming in from Poland to Japan. Probably not just Poland, but Poland is the main exit point for most of the refugees. More than 4 million refugees from Ukraine at the current point. So you can see that Japanese policy is changing as we talk. The Japanese government has not been known for supporting or for being very accommodating to refugees, to people who seek asylum. There have been thousands who have made applications, and the numbers that have been admitted is in the dozens. So this policy change is very large. It's happening very quickly, and the Kishida administration is beginning to create their stamp of what it means to be a Kishida administration as opposed to a Suga administration, or even larger, an Abe administration. So there's a lot of action going on there. Something is happening almost every day, and it's not just with regard to the refugees. There's a lot of policy changes that are undergoing lots of changes. For example, Japan's relationship with Russia. We talked about the expulsion of several Russian diplomats last week. Russia, responded in kind and expelled some Japanese diplomats as well. But one of the problems that Japan has is that the four Northern Territory islands that are occupied by Russia since the end of World War II, the Russian military has decided to hold exercises and missile tests just recently. It's had more than 100 air incursions over the last 18 months. And this is pretty alarming, especially when you've got kind of the same thing going on in China and Taiwan. So it's not quite saber rattling, but it sure is alarming. And in the context of what's going on with Ukraine didn't have nuclear weapons, and Russia kind of invaded many say as a consequence of Ukraine not being able to defend itself, not being a member of NATO. Shares a lot of characteristics with the Japanese situation. Although Japan has the defense cooperation with the United States and the nuclear umbrella that they enjoyed uniquely there, but still the tension is beginning to build, and it's very uncomfortable. The missile tests that are going on there, you've got missile tests with North Korea too. It's just a really difficult state of affairs. In light of that, the Kishida administration has also announced a change in policy with regard to two nuclear issues. The first nuclear issue is nuclear power, since coal is going to be reduced a little bit. And you might remember maybe 4 weeks ago, there was a claim by the power companies to reduce your energy consumption. You remember that? It was on a Sunday and a Monday. And companies reduced their wattage of lights, and shops turned down their lights. And it was because, due to the earthquake, the amount of energy that was available in the Tokyo area was reduced, and there was a little bit of fear that there might be a blackout. People cooperated, of course, and there was no blackout, but it did cause a little bit of fear that we don't have complete reliance on the renewable energies, on the thermal heat generation, the wind farms, that sort of thing. And the Japanese government really needs to think hard about something that's more reliable. Their response was, we need to continue to go nuclear. So for those people who still remember the triple disaster after the Fukushima and the tsunami and the earthquake in 2011, it looks like the policy is going to be towards more nuclear generation. It's somewhat inevitable, especially in the current situation. It's a long lead time to develop that, but there are many nuclear power stations that are sitting somewhat idle, and I think you're going to see some changes there. The second issue is hosting nuclear weapons on Japan. There are 3 nuclear principles that Japan has adopted and adhered to. That is, not hosting, not producing, and not allowing to be on the property of Japan any nuclear weapons. And I think the Japan government has decided that that's not really feasible, and it's not feasible for a couple of reasons. One is that with what's going on in North Korea and their tests and the intimidating launches that they're having, Japan needs to rethink their policies in order to protect their people. And following that to the next logical step, the Japanese government has considered, and the LDP is gradually supporting, this is very much endorsed by Mr. Abe, having first strike capabilities, or at least having retaliatory capabilities. This is somewhat alarming because this is not defense in nature. This is offensive and against what the peace constitution has. Article 9 prevents that sort of capability. And it appears that regardless of what the Constitution says, the Japanese government is moving in that direction for protective purposes. So I envision that in very close order, even before a referendum or a change of the Constitution is put to the Congress or put to the referendum, that Japan will change its stance on the defense capabilities and on the nuclear principles that it is adhered to. So keep your eye on that because it's going to be moving very, very quickly. President Biden has not visited Japan. He was scheduled to. Nancy Pelosi was supposed to be in town last week with the delegation, a bipartisan delegation that visited Tokyo. She couldn't because she caught COVID just 2 days earlier, so her trip was canceled. But Mr. Biden also moved his slated date. I think it was going to be in April. It's now in May, maybe May 24th they're talking about. He will come to Tokyo for Quad discussions. So you might remember that there's a lot of push with the Prime Minister talking with the President of India, a member of Quad, and accepting a lot of not concessions, but issues that are important to India that Japan hasn't spent much attention on up until now. So there's a real push between Japan, Australia, and the United States to accommodate India, to pull them into this Quad relationship. Of the 4 countries, India is the one that's kind of not as enthusiastic as the other 3 for a lot of different reasons, but it receives almost 90% of its military armament from Russia. So it's in a bit of a difficult position. And with the sanctions against Russia and what's going on with Ukraine and the quote genocide characterization, India has been very reluctant to be very accommodating to the positions of Japan, the United States. And also, I think we can get into it a little bit later if you'd like to, but the position of Japan with regard to Ukraine and Russia has really changed, and I think it's changed in line with what the United States is trying to achieve. So that unity of purpose, I think, has been achieved. And if you're looking at how Japan is going to react, it's somewhat rare for the Japanese to act so aggressively with regard to, for example, the sanctions or for accepting refugees. But I think that's accommodating, the United States position, this desire to have a coalition of forces against what's what the Russians are doing in Ukraine. And I think that's the major policy of the United States, and and Japan is, in contributing to that, and you can see it in a lot of different ways. The radio spectrum in Japan is very closely guarded by the telecommunications ministry. That was the ministry of Mr. Suga. He was the minister of telecommunications before he became prime minister. And you might remember that when he became prime minister, he almost immediately encouraged the telecommunications companies to reduce their phone rates. And this generated a lot of goodwill directed towards him because he was able to pull that off. He's so familiar with the companies that are doing that sort of thing. And it actually had a positive effect on the GDP. That lasted for about 10 months. And the spectrum now is going through a bit of a challenge. The spectrum is the radio spectrum, and the Japanese government manages that. You might have noticed that there are so few radio stations or television stations because that spectrum, that bandwidth, is closely monitored. There's a discussion going on now to take the bandwidth and open it up because of 5G and the many uses and the needs for extended bandwidth. And the main players, KDDI, NTT, Docomo, SoftBank, are all vying for that spectrum. There was an issue that was floated out this last week about opening that spectrum up to a policy of auctions. So right now, the Japanese government parcels these out, these spectrum slots out to these companies. And the issue these days, right now, the discussion these days is for auctioning those off. So to the highest bidder goes a particular spectrum. And I think it will probably go in that direction for a couple of reasons. One of those is that Japan's economy is characterized by several industries that are not quite monopolies, but they're oligarchies, meaning that they're dominated by 3 or 4, maybe 5 players. Banking is like that. Automobiles are like that. Telecommunications is like that. There are a couple of industries that are just dominated by 3 or 4 players. And with Mr. Suga in his current situation, you might remember that he was the only prime minister that didn't have a political faction when he became prime minister. But holy Lord, he's going to put one together now. He's got more than 70 people who are lined up if he forms a faction to be on his list. And in order to do that, you need to generate, money, cash, goodwill. You need to have a base of support. So it looks like this auctioning of radio bandwidth is in line with some other political moves that are going on. And I think that in due course, maybe even before the election of the upper house, Mr. Suga is going to step out and form his faction. It's right now a group. And if he does launch this, and there are 70 members in his group, it will be the number 2 political faction, far surpassing, what's going on with Mr. Motegi or Mr. Nikai. It'll just be a creation of a new faction, and it'll be something unique in Japanese politics. So let's keep our eye on that. Kishida, the administration, has received a great boost in the arm with the approval rating of the cabinet. We talk about the approval rating of the prime minister from time to time. Today's discussion is about the cabinet approval. There was a poll that was taken. It's taken every month. The results came out just this last week. And the LDP has really taken a good hit. And the appreciation of the Japanese people who participated in the poll have said, 52% have said, we approve of the president's or the cabinet's handling of the economy, what they're doing with COVID, what they're doing with Russian sanctions. And it's the highest that it's been in the Kishida administration. So it's very good news for Mr. Kishida. And when you take a look at the approval rating and the disapproval rating is about 20%. And there are 27% who just don't care. They don't know in the poll that was conducted. That's kind of reflective of how, Japan or Japanese people vote ordinarily. Most of the people really don't care. They don't have an opinion. Not most, but in this poll, it was 27%, and I think that's somewhat to be expected. But 52% that are saying that they do support it, they're pleased with what the results are, is very good. And the disapproval rate, the people who say no, they stink, they're not doing a good job, decreased by 4%, 4 percentage points. So that's very good. They also reported on Ishin no Kai. They did really well in the lower house election 6 months ago, and their approval rating is 3.8%. They came in at number 2. So you've got the LDP, their approval rating of the cabinet is 52%. The LDP similarly enjoys that number, and the second political party that has an approval rating in second place is Ishin, and their approval rating is at 3.8%. So the Constitutional Democratic Party is 3.5. Komeito, the party in the coalition with the LDP, has an approval rating of 2.7. This is just miserable, isn't it? So you think that the Japanese government being run by the LDP, and that there is a cohesive opposition camp that they can fight against, the party in power. It's just not an accurate statement. So this builds up to what the election will pretends for the election, with the LDP being in a strong position, the Japanese population evaluating the cabinet very strongly because of the response to the sanctions with Russia, the adoption of refugees from Ukraine. People are supporting that, and also the response from COVID. We didn't talk very much about COVID. There is a new strain that's coming out. It came in about a week ago. Thank goodness it came from a Japanese national, not a foreigner, but it did come from the United States. The traveler came in from the United States. It's a new strain. It's a strain that's a recombinant strain. That means that it's formed of 2 strains that are recombined within the carrier's body. The carrier was asymptomatic. That means she didn't have any signs that she was, growing a third eye, or that she had a high temperature, but she did have that strain. The problem with the COVID response now is that Tokyo and Osaka, the numbers are somewhat stabilized. Sometimes they're down, sometimes they're up. But overall, the more rural counties, the prefectures, are suffering explosions in rates. And many analysts say that we are already in the 6th wave of a resurgence. So that means the prospect of having another quasi-emergency is coming up. In light of that, and Maya, you know this, because the Tourism Association sent delegations to Hawaii to rejigger the travel route for Japanese citizens to go to Hawaii. So that route is opening up. They're experimenting with bringing more people in. You might have heard that foreign nationals who have relatives who want to come to Japan can now apply. So that's a new thing that happened between our last briefing and this briefing. So there's movement on a lot of different levels, but there's also a bit of a tendency to be hesitant because the numbers are not quite showing a downward trend. If you're watching the numbers, it looks like it might be taking a bit of a turn. And in most of these situations, when it's going down, it continues to go down. But when it starts to turn, it always turns and it goes into another wave. So it's something to be watching very carefully. There's a lot more to talk about. I think I've gone on long enough now, almost half an hour in this briefing. I'd like to close that up and open the floor for questions to everybody except Maya. And I guess we'll switch over here from just LinkedIn to exclusively to Clubhouse. Is that right, Maya?
It is right. Thank you very much for the briefing, for doing it from the good ship Santana. Of course, we're moving to Clubhouse now. I invite everybody who wants to share their comments, observations, questions, and different opinions to join us there on stage. So please save Timothy from me, because otherwise he may jump overboard. Who knows, really? All right.
It's looking very tempting.
Tempting, right? But you should be careful, because there are quite a few birds there, right? And it may be dangerous if they come on. Seahawks.
These are Seahawks.
Right.
They're really huge birds. Yes, very beautiful. And this hill behind me, I think they occupy that in the thousands. So it's really fun to watch them.
Great. Okay, so thank you, and I'll see you on the other side.
See you on the Clubhouse side. Thank you, everybody. See you next week.
See you.